Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel session this afternoon, talking about AI and ethics and governance from a risk management perspective, and how that impacts particularly the built environment, but also what we can learn from other sectors as well. And I'm very much thankful to Lynn Robinson at the International Institute of Communications for setting up this panel with two of our tech partners at RICS. It's great to collaborate with professional bodies like this and to get the information and the insight from a real mix of people. So just as by way of introduction for those listening who perhaps aren't familiar with either organisation, RICS is a global standard setting and regulatory body for the built-in natural environment. We've got over 130,000 members working worldwide, and those members practice right across the property life cycle and also across a great mix of assets from land, rural, commercial, residential, infrastructure, alternative assets. So it's a very broad area of practice that impacts both businesses and consumers in quite a significant way. And the International Institute of Communications exists to inform and thereby shape the global policy agenda for the ICT and digital ecosystem. Its members believe that the impact of technological innovation on society should be evaluated and discussed openly, and that policy and regulation should maximise both the public interest and promote innovation and investment. And now the IIC is the only independent international forum that brings together statutory national regulators, global commercial operators, and end user representatives in a neutral environment to debate policy issues. So thanks once again for Lynn. Lynn and I both used to work RICS together, so it was a great piece of collaboration to think about this first session between the two organisations. So without further ado, let's go around the virtual table and get some introductions from our panel today. So Addie Cook, perhaps I could ask you to give us a few words on your background and role.
Yeah, sure. So happy to be here. Thanks for including Google. And by way of introduction, I work for Google Cloud. So I am focused on our business-to-business integrations of AI serving customers around the globe. In this role, I specifically not only handle sort of our public policy agenda that's external facing for artificial intelligence issues, but I also support our internal team's efforts to incorporate responsible AI into our external product launches, technology partnerships, and customer engagements. I'm happy to join this call and talk about sort of the intricacies of our responsibilities in this space, our customers, partnerships, and the role that governance plays. And I think this is a really timely topic. So thanks for hosting us today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Addie. Cordell, could I bring you online?
Hi, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. My name is Cordell Green. My background is in law and broadcasting. I'm currently the executive director of the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica, which regulates electronic media. I'm also Jamaica's representative on the UNESCO's Information for All program, which is one of its intergovernmental bodies. And in that capacity, I am a vice chair of the International Bureau and chairman of UNESCO IFAP's working group on information accessibility, which convenes an annual conference, AI for IA. It might also be relevant to mention that I am on the board of advisors of the Carnegie AI Equality Initiative and sit on a couple IEEE working groups dealing with artificial intelligence, looking at governance in particular.
Great, thanks very much, Cordell. Dan, a few words from you by way of introduction.
Yeah, hello, really nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So Dan Hughes, I spent my career working in data across the built environment, looking at it from as many different angles as possible. My day job is running Alpha Property Insight, which is a consultancy which helps property and technology companies with data in the built environment. For example, working for a startup that's looking at AI at the moment called RE5Q. And also looking at digital risk. I think digital risk is for all of the benefits that come with technology, of which there are many. I think there are lots of challenges and problems. So really, really pleased to be talking about this. I'm also involved with the Real Estate Data Foundation, which is a not-for-profit initiative working across the property sector, trying to raise data ethics up the agenda. And it's supported by a number of industry bodies such as RICS, which I'm very grateful. So very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dan. And last but not least, Emre.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name's Emre Kazim. Thanks for this invitation, Andrew. So maybe just as a way of introducing myself, it's also a way to kind of to say how I know Andrew. So I was a research fellow in the computer science department at University College London, and we were working on lots and lots of experimental stuff. And in the computer science department, and it was because of all this kind of moral panic, that's how I was describing it at the time, regarding the kind of robots taking over and all the evils of Facebook. So we're working in this kind of research space, very interdisciplinary, and we were doing lots and lots of stuff with regulators, government, industry, etc. The reason why I give that context is I think it is a multidisciplinary space. It's a very new space. It's a very dynamic space, and we're all kind of finding our way at this point. What we did, myself and Adriano Koshiyama, who was also a research fellow there, is we spun out a company from UCL. The company is called Holistic AI, and we do risk management of algorithms at scale. So we're very much about the application and really operationalizing the kind of ethics and policy and regulatory agenda from a kind of scalable software perspective. Thanks again, Andrew, for this invitation.
Pleasure. Now, before I bring Dan back in again to talk about the kind of built and natural environment specifically, it'd be great to get a bit of an introduction from the rest of you around, almost some terms and definitions here about how we should be kind of talking and describing this mix of algorithms, statistical approaches, AI, what we feel is a useful kind of set of terms to use here. Perhaps I could start you with Addie and say, well, what should we be calling this kind of basket of approaches that's getting bundled in this, dare I say, this term AI?
Yeah, look, and I never like to opine on a concrete definition of AI. I was actually participating in a different roundtable this morning with Axel Voss of the European side of the pond, and he was advocating. He has been advocating for the OECD's definition of AI, which I actually think is pretty smart. It's already accepted globally. It's been sort of settled at an international level, and I think that's what we're all striving for as businesses that have to operate across jurisdictions, best to settle on something that's already been decided instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think going one level deeper, the other debate that's happening in Europe right now is whether it should be regulations should be scoped to machine learning only, or it should be also include other types of algorithms that maybe aren't self-learning. And I think there's a case to be made for both. I won't say one way or the other, but I can see where machine learning does necessarily beg more risk. You have to have a bigger risk appetite. And I think, Emre doing risk management over there, when we think about, auditability, explainability, it's just naturally harder for machine learning. So I understand those who advocate for a greater focus there. I hope that answered your question, Andrew. I'm sure others have more nuanced answers.
What are your thoughts on this, Cordell, in terms of the various roles you're in and talking about AI? What do you see as the scope of that definition and this challenge of so many approaches there?
Well, I defer to Addie, and and say ditto. There's so many definitions. I don't try to keep up. I come to it from a kind of non-engineering background, and I'm very comfortable to say I basically see it as complex mathematics. We're really talking about a general purpose technology, which is transversal in its effects. But you have asked us to locate it on a spectrum. And for me, that spectrum really is about how a whole range of exponential technologies are changing the operating systems of society. So it's the integration of informatics, it's AI, it's robotics, it's nanotechnology, molecular engineering, biotechnology, and all of those combining to lead a transformation. And the interest in it is that the transformation is happening at a scale that is much, much larger in a far more compressed time span than the first industrial revolution, which is why it is not an ordinary development.
What are your thoughts, Emre? I know a lot of your papers have used the word algorithm, I suppose, deliberately to be sort of quite inclusive, or perhaps, you know, inclusive in terms of allowing for that range.
Yeah, so in a way, there was this kind of attempt. The engineers used to just map out these different kind of machine learning models, and then just trying to map out what do we mean by each one of them and the kind of risks associated with each of them. And then the EU came along and just like flipped everything and said, any kind of decision assisting system. And you know what? It was kind of, I remember it being a little bit mocked, but now I realize it was actually a stroke of genius. So from our perspective, let's say the stuff that we're interested in, the public trust perspective, it very much is any kind of system that's being used. That's why we're using algorithms that has some kind of impact on a human being. So if you're using a neural network to generate a word cloud, who cares, right? But if you're using an Excel sheet to decide on candidates or sieve CVs, then all of a sudden it matters. So we kind of approached it much more from the impact perspective and saying, okay, insofar as there's a context in which there's some kind of issue in terms of harm, then we need to think about the level of, we think about the kind of assurance that we've required or assessment we've required in that context, and whatever the kind of complexity of the system is, it will be warranted by the use case rather than, let's say, the nature of the technology stack.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks very much. Well, moving to you, Dan, and obviously sort of tapping into your huge experience in the built and natural environment, what do you see as being the kind of key areas where that particular sector is being impacted by AI and thus the ethical issues that come out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big subject. I'm also tempted to follow after Cordell and just say ditto to everything everyone said. But I think it's worth taking a step back in real estate and just looking at the sector and some of the cultural characteristics of it, and why we then have great opportunities, but also some challenges. And real estate and the built environment generally is an enormous sector. It's absolutely huge by any measurement, but it's also incredibly fragmented. So the majority of companies within it tend to be relatively small, relatively slow moving, and they're sort of on the SME side of things. So we aren't a sector that's had to make decisions very fast in the past, and we're very low risk. We want to make sure we're very evidence based. So we just don't have the culture of taking huge amounts of data and making fast decisions. And we're being faced with this tidal wave of data that's coming at us, and we need technology to help us, but we don't have any of the understanding or the structures in place to really deal with that properly. And I think we're probably at the very early stages of seeing that. So I think the obvious places are around efficiency. You can use technology, machine learning, AI, whatever it might be, to do things quicker and more efficiently. And I think that's where a lot of the focus has been at the moment. But against the backdrop of things like ESG, quite rightly going to the top of the agenda, all of a sudden the property decisions in the past have been based around, will I fit into that building, and what's the rent and what's the cost of running it? All of a sudden it's what do people think of it? How can I attract staff? How does it impact the environment? What's the air quality? All of which have data on it. So the decisions we're making are having to change very, very quickly and consume many more factors. And there's more data on all those factors. And we just can't possibly cope with that as people. So as a sector, we're very human driven. We'll do it in our brains. We'll make very human decisions on a very small amount of data and then our gut feel. A lot of the disciplines in property are described as an art, not a science, which is not a phrase I particularly like. But I think that as we get more and more data, we can use all of those technologies to better inform the decisions. The problem is, and I think this is what's already come up already, is that for all of the efficiency and all the better decisions that we can make about everything, we also start as real estate practitioners losing transparency, because we can't possibly understand everything that goes into making that decision. So if I have a spreadsheet with 20 data points on, it's pretty easy for me to understand where they've come from, what they are, and therefore how they inform my decision. I can justify that. If I have millions and billions of data points going to algorithms that are constantly changing themselves because they're learning from themselves, that gets really, really difficult. So huge amounts of opportunity, lots and lots of benefits. I think real estate is a really good sector in so many ways, but we haven't yet got the skills and the experience and the structure to deal with some of this vast amount of data that's coming.
Thanks, Dan. Now, the next question, I guess, is it almost goes to the heart of the whole discussion, and I appreciate it's not easy to answer in a very quick sentence, but I'm really keen not to lose sight of the fact that there's often a kind of a feeling that anything kind of AI is inherently dangerous, rather than also focusing on the fact there are opportunities here to be taken. And I guess my question is, how do we kind of get that balance between managing the risks but not choking off the huge opportunities it presents? I mean, Addie, what are your thoughts on that balancing act between risk and opportunity?
Yeah, no, I would just say, and Dan, jumping off from what Dan kind of left with, which is, there might be a lack of experience in the real estate sector. I won't confess to know a ton about it, but what I can say is across sectors, there are certain applications of AI that will support any business, and those are largely administrative in function. So one example that comes to mind for me is invoice processing, paperwork processing. We have a solution, our competitors have a solution. Ours is called Doc AI, which can parse information from tons of applications, which you see kind of across the real estate, the insurance sector, and turning paper documents or unstructured documents into structured data already is just a jumping off point for unlocking insights and new abilities to process data. That is largely a sort of a low risk use case. We're just talking about back office functions. So when we think about the insurance industry broadly, we shouldn't just assume that everything in it is high risk. We still must apply sort of the traditional risk tiering frameworks. And I would say when you move towards, in real estate where you're trying to, or insurance, when you're trying to assign an assessment of somebody's property in terms of its proclivity to be flooded or to have an earthquake and then assign a premium, that is higher risk, right? That hits people where they live directly in their home or in their pocketbook. And so as we look across industries, I always try to remind any regulator we're talking to that it doesn't matter which industry, if it's in insurance or it's in retail, there still need risk frameworks. And I'm sure others have more to say on that.
Yeah. Cordell, what are your thoughts on this balancing act? This let's take advantage, but how do we manage risk?
You don't want me to say ditta to Addie again.
No.
That's becoming like the chorus now, okay? So prepare yourself for that song. I like it. It's titled Addie, okay? And it's ditta Addie. Okay, so I heard someone put it in a very succinct and helpful way, which is that we must not only focus on the misuse of AI, but the misuse of AI. Very smart, but easier said than done, because there are some harms which just can't be measured against benefits. What are those harms? Well, that's where it gets debatable. But I am attracted to the European approach, which says, take a tiered approach to regulation, treat human rights and human safety as sacrosanct, and you start from there. I don't believe it's a new concept. You are going to ask us later to talk about other industries. That's what aviation is about. And if we begin to de-engineer artificial intelligence and take a human-centric approach, then I believe we will treat with AI the way we treat with law, the way we treat with economics, the way we treat with psychology, and take a sociological approach. This is about what is beneficial to society. To the extent you can do a cost-benefit analysis and it is practicable, you do that. To the extent you're struggling with a cost-benefit analysis, probably that is an indication that this is something we ought not to do in terms of a particular use case. From a layman's point of view, that's how I see it.
Emre, what are your thoughts on this balancing act?
Yeah, so I think it's as in there is a kind. Well, there's one of the dangers, if you will, is that the best way to stop anything bad from happening is just to do nothing. And the thing is, the opportunities are just too vast and too important for us to not really grasp this thing, or not kind of take the problem of governance seriously enough in terms of enabling the technology to be used, rather than thinking of it as a kind of line of defense. So I really take the point about the risk frameworks and the triaging that was mentioned earlier by Addie. So we need methods to kind of quickly identify what's the kind of systems that we need to do a really kind of code and data inspection on, and what are the kind of systems that are quite just very readily are quite benign. So I think that because we've got lots and lots of activity, policy and regulatory activity in this space, there's a lot of confusion, and it's leading to a kind of risk-averse attitude. Whereas if we get it right, we should have mechanisms, if we will, quite readily, where we can follow a kind of not a very laborious or burdensome, let's say, governance structure, to know that, look, there are some sets of systems which we really need to just think very seriously about, but majority of systems are probably going to remain as benign. I say that because we were thinking about this in particular with respect to harm, and we found lots and lots of ironic examples of cases where systems were biased or harmful as a result of the training data, which was just a complete kind of condemnation of human decision making. So it was effectively just reflecting or reifying or the things that legacy systems. So the idea of let's not use this, the system is biased, would have just put us back into systems which were effectively horrible for vast groups or vast swathes of society anyway. So the opportunity is it's not just in terms of it's creating new harms. In many ways, actually, the opportunity is to reduce kind of some kind of societal ills or ills that have existed, that AI systems or governing AI systems surface those kind of assumptions, and that maybe we can make meaningful interventions on.
Indeed. Thanks, Emre. I mean, thinking about real estate specifically, Dan, I mean, obviously, perhaps automated valuation is a good example where the spectrum of kind of algorithmic approaches is already taking place in real estate. And I know there's been already some instances where that has been seen to be risky and harmful. What are your thoughts about that kind of automated valuation area and how it has already impacted the sector for good or ill?
So if I just go back a little bit to the previous questions, I think in terms of the balance, of course, it is a balancing act, but there's no question that real estate has to do both. We have to leverage this technology because it's unavoidable for the benefit and the opportunity it presents, and we have to consider about how we govern that and make sure it's done in an ethical way. So we have to do both. I think that the culture of real estate and the business processes is that slow, low risk, backward looking approach to things, and we tend to want to do everything perfectly in a one-off hit, and that's really not the way that we need to go forward testing some of these technologies. So we need to make sure it's a very transparent framework for organizations to test things and work out whether it works. So we're not going to one extreme of let's not try everything, as Emre said, we just don't do anything because it's low risk. On the flip side, let's not try everything and boil the ocean at the same time, and getting that balance, I think, is the key. In terms of the valuation side of things, if you look at the factors that drive buying behavior within properties, then it goes back to what I was saying earlier about those broader data sets. So things like the impact on sustainability, attractiveness of staff, and so on, makes a real difference to whether people want to work in a building, therefore pay rent, and therefore the value of it. So we're having more and more data coming into it, and I think we're at the point where, probably not quite there yet, but we're at the point where the regulations and the standards from an RICS point of view are going to be really challenged moving forward, where we either go down the route of having a valuer who can very easily explain everything that they've done, or we go down the route of having the most amazing technology that's incredibly complicated and gives the best answer, but can't be easily explained by the valuer. And I think what we need to do is think about how we have different levels of expertise and different people to authenticate and to qualify things that people shouldn't be experts in. So it's a little bit like, the analogy I use is a little bit like building a building a few hundred years ago. You could have one person who would design it and fund it and build it and put it all together. If you go to a large building now, you wouldn't ask a fund manager to design the structural steelwork, just because there are so many specialisms around it that you need to have all of those. And I'm not sure we're yet caught up as an industry in making sure that those regulations catch up. So certainly there's an opportunity for efficiency from a valuations point of view. We've seen a lot of that. I think just some of the simple examples Addie gave about documents and collecting the data from those is a really good one. It's an industry that uses a lot of documents and a lot of historical data. But I think that informing the decision, the value, and what's going to happen over time is also where there's a lot of opportunity. But that is going to be harder for a valuer to be able to understand what happens. I don't think we're yet at the stage where that's a clear and present problem, but we're definitely moving in that direction.
Thanks. And a specific question for you, Addie, around the kind of, I sort of phrased it almost the center of gravity, where you've got, a vendor like yourself, producing an algorithmic tool that's then being used by a business customer who's then using that for consumers. How do you see that balancing act where you've got that kind of vendor business user? It's like a B to B to C type environment where you've got all these stakeholders involved, and arguably you've got other people perhaps supplying the data set. So it's quite a complex system of actors. And where does that sort of center of gravity lie? And how do you manage that kind of set of stakeholders?
I'll try to be brief in this answer. You could literally have like a whole day's workshop just on this concept. And it really gets to the heart of risk management, right? Which is, here in Google Cloud, we have sort of two processes that kind of define our risk management approach. One is when we're developing a product, we work really closely within our engineering teams from a cross-functional point of view. I'm a policy person. We have legal folks. We have ethicists. There's sort of an all hands on deck approach to evaluating a product. And in that process, we have several questions where we ask ourselves, how is the customer reasonably going to use this? Where are the challenges going to come in terms of their ability to serve their customers? What documentation can we provide them that will say, here's how to use it, here's not how to use it, here's the types of data that will work with it, or even here's the types of data we use to train the product on, because inevitably it will be retrained for a specific purpose for which the customer is intending to use it. We have to provide all of this documentation and oversight, and eventually we will get to a space where we'll be audited on that governance process. And then we hand it to a customer, and they should theoretically repeat most of those same checks and balances. They need to understand that they fully understand the product, understand how their data could or could not work in the environment they intend to use it. And then they also need to understand their obligations to their customers to report how they're using AI on their customers, because consumers, especially as we're seeing in the EU, will necessarily be required to be told when AI is used that in a way that affects their life, liberty, or happiness. But it's a balancing act. And I think, honestly, this is one of the harder challenges for all of the risk management frameworks I'm monitoring across the world: Singapore, the United States, the European Union, our standards organizations. And I think we will eventually get this right, because we have other concepts to fall back on, like the controller processor concept in privacy policy. I think is a really strong example of how we can get this right in regulation.
Thanks. I'll probably,
Andrew, can I just?
Yeah, sure.
So I was just going to say, can I just come back on that really quickly? And again, I agree with all of that. But I think in real estate, there's a real temptation to recognize there are complexities and problems and just assume that the technology companies are going to deal with it and leave it with them. And I don't think that's a good enough answer for real estate companies. And I was talking to someone the other day about using cameras within the residential buildings. So you can use cameras to identify where people are, where in the room, what their activity is, and you can use all sorts of clever technology. And I think most people would throw their hands up and say, that feels pretty invasive. I don't want to know about it. On the flip side, if you're talking about retirement homes, where that sort of technology is being used and was very transparently used, so you can let people have their independence rather than having to go somewhere else, and maybe that's a much more ethical use. So it isn't just about the technology, it's about how it's applied as well. And I think in the real estate sector, we are really, really guilty of either not thinking about it at all, which is probably the most common answer, or at least thinking, don't worry, Google have all these clever people who are going to sort it out, so it can't possibly be a problem for us to use. And I think that's a real challenge for us. And I would say that picking up on things like the privacy side of things, that the approach I would certainly encourage is don't bury your head in the sand. And answering this all overnight is going to be a really big problem. But if you act in a sort of trying to do the right thing, taking steps in the right direction of being transparent about it, that is a really, really positive step forwards, a step in the right direction.
Thanks, Dan. Now, perhaps going around the virtual table, I might start with you, Emre, if I may. And because you're in that privileged position of looking at all the various sectors you're working with, what would be your words of advice, the learnings that you've seen in other sectors that can build on those kind of comments that Dan's made about not abdicating responsibility to the tech vendors, almost that thinking about context and taking responsibility. What would your learnings be from the other sectors you're working with?
Yeah, so as you know, Andrew, what we started doing was auditing of systems. And what was really interesting about that is that we had the problem of, which I think is being described in different ways here, of like explainability or transparency, but we had it in an internal sense. So we had the problem of explaining the result of the audit to like executives, which was a good exercise because like they're genuinely invested. They really have this problem of they want to have command and control over their algorithms. And that's even before, let's say, that's a kind of motivated audience. And that's before, let's say, the kind of public sphere of like these kind of obligations being applied to kind of the public space. So actually, there's a lot of lessons to be learned across the board. One is that we found that the most effective kind of engagement has come with by executives right at the top that are just kind of anticipating this and are really quite motivated to take this seriously. Secondly, the kind of reporting that we do, or that we've ended up doing, the documentation, is layered. So like right at the top, it's this kind of red, amber, green. And then like when you go through the kind of assurance report, or you go through the kind of report, then you can go right down. And I think most of these kind of transparency obligations are probably going to be something similar to think about within a company, that there has to be, if you will, different messages for different audiences, just in terms of the kind of level of technical depth. Mm. The third thing is that there's a lot of solutions we've spoken about privacy, and it's very natural that we go into that kind of conversation about privacy. But the problem with the privacy, let's say in the UK and the European approach, was that we took a very non-technical approach to monitoring these kind of systems. So we had the kind of DPIA, where you would just kind of report certain kinds of information. And there's two problems what we found when we were doing it with AI. In a way, we thought that's maybe a great way to do it as well, to do the equivalent of a DPIA, but for AI systems. And there were two problems. One was, can you validate the information that's being reported? So there was no way to actually test or prove those kind of things unless you really had an invasive mechanism. And the second thing is that they were not making, what does it mean to monitor, or what does it mean to kind of assure or audit a dynamic system? So we were generating kind of snapshot approaches. So really the kind of learnings from industry are, think about how to do it. Everyone's having the problem of doing this, trying to solve this problem at scale. Thinking about how they can do this in a way that meaningfully monitors systems in a continuous fashion. And think about how the documentation or reporting off the back of those kind of assessments is able to speak to different kinds of audience, from customer to the kind of executive, all the way to the kind of regulator. So these are the kind of general problems that we found.
Thanks. Cordell, what are you seeing in other sectors that you think real estate could usefully learn from?
Well, first of all, I think for me, if you look at, let's take pharmaceuticals and aviation, I get the impression, and certainly when you step on an aeroplane, you go on there with a sense of assurance that there is risk management taking place. And it's not just about mitigating risk, it's coming as close to zero risk as possible. You're not left to your own devices, your sense of awareness and knowledge. And the same thing would apply to your motor car, unless you're an enthusiast. You get in there, you basically know the basics, you expect it to work. And that's not a problem, because your motor car doesn't take decisions for you. When your motor car starts to take decisions, or the idea is that your motor car will get to the stage where it is prescient and it has human-like characteristics and it is influential, it becomes a very different conversation. And in that conversation, we introduce concepts such as explainability, it gets a bit murky. It becomes difficult to emphasize explainability in a way that shifts liability and responsibility, let us say, to the user. Because, and we get into the realm of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, and so on. I don't believe that can work with a black box system. Quite apart from that, explainability, in my view, is predicated on a rebuttable presumption about a level of digital literacy, which doesn't comport with reality. The average citizen has no clue about the close acquaintance of human beings with intelligence systems. No clue whatsoever about the model, the value of data, and the risks that are inherent in some of these systems, that the very developers don't know all the risks. And that not only are risks latent, but we can point out what we call low-scale risks or low risks, but these can accumulate and have big impacts. So you have some people who say, oh, well, let's just kind of say there are some things that don't require regulatory attention, like a recommender system, which movie you should watch and so on. Well, I don't agree. That's a rebuttable presumption, but you have to test it. Because if the recommender system crosses a line and it becomes manipulative, it's a very different consideration. So I really get back to, this is why I'm very attracted to the European approach of tiered regulation to the extent you can measure impact on human rights and human safety, and you scale your regulation accordingly, and you put your hubris in check, and you allow for flexibility, because your assessment today is based on rebuttable presumptions about what is essentially a black box system, which comes with a lot of opacity. So that's my perspective, with a regulatory bias, of course.
Thank you. Well, Emre, yeah, quickly.
Sorry, Connor. So we've been having real problems with this concept of consent. And it was to say that, can one meaningfully consent to these kind of systems? Because it looks to us like the transparency obligations that the EU regulation is putting forward are going to mirror the kind of cookie consent. And it looks quite, honestly, it looks a little bit farcical to us. That so we're just going to click a button and say, I'm interacting with an AI. Now, when this is motivated for us from a dual perspective, one is that we question, and this question that you make, the point you were making about digital literacy, we were trying to find an analogy in the let's say legislation, and we found some stuff in financial and in fintech to do with the sophisticated user. So there has to be a certain level of competence, if you will, to be able to meaningfully subscribe to a certain financial instrument. And what we found is that there's there's let's say a kind of informational threshold, and then there's a second concern, which is the information in any sense available? So that's much more acute in those kind of systems that you're describing as black box. Most of the systems, to be honest, that we look at are not black box. And the reason why I try to make that point in this context is that it's not an excuse not to report by saying, oh, the system's just way too complex, or most of the systems are way more simple than that. But absolutely take your point, Connor. And the problem for us is we think it's going to go down the road. From a company perspective, it's good for us, because then we'll just say the way in which you become compliant is by putting up some kind of kickbox. But from a kind of, let's say, philosophical or ethical perspective, we share the same concern. And the problem is, I don't know another construct other than permissioned consent that looks on the horizon. But then it's a deeper question. So one of the pushbacks we get, Cornel, and I'll put this to you, is then, are we being arrogant? Are we calling for a kind of paternalistic approach, which is we have a duty of care, and we will decide, you know, that this is or this isn't in the public interest, or this is or isn't good for humanity or people writ large. So like there's a cost also to that side. And Corner, honestly, we don't know. We've been like we've been working on these problems for a long time, more broadly in the kind of human computer interface space. But I don't know, like I think this is a very difficult problem that you're
I
pointing
don't
to.
think it is either. It should be both. That you pay attention to digital literacy, and the companies have an obligation as well to ensure that the users are as digitally literate as possible. And you also give continual assurance of monitoring and maintenance throughout the life cycle, and give us the assurance that the model works over time, designed for the as originally intended. Because it is black box in the sense that we don't know what is going on. I agree with you that it is not a new concept. Most of us don't open the bonnets of our vehicles and understand anything that's going on in there in terms of the computerized network. I believe what makes this difference, and the concept of the black box I see as more expansive, are the consequences of the close relations that humans are having with these artificial intelligent systems without a full appreciation of that relationship. And that's largely because of information asymmetry, not always sort of complex engineering.
Addie, what are your thoughts on this? This has stimulated a fascinating debate, and obviously, from your position at Google, you must have seen lots of different sectors. What are your takeaways?
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated. Actually going to ask Emre if he had, you know, any papers that he was looking at in particular for the concept of consent. And I would just cross the concept of consent over to risk tiering. And I just wonder if maybe the consent approach needs to be different by risk tiers. And I kind of hesitate to do that because in my mind, I see the pop-up screen for sort of the low risk, you know, Netflix recommendations. But then I think to like, you know, as Emre said, in financial services or in healthcare, maybe it wasn't Emre, it was somebody else, but financial services and healthcare, which are higher risk sectors where if a consumer is exposed to an artificial intelligence algorithm, they might not consent to be, you know, to have their cancer, you know, cancer screenings be evaluated by artificial intelligence. They might say, no, I only want a doctor to look at that. And what are the consequences of that? And, you know, I think even in that situation, are they making an informed decision to reject or accept those risks, as Cordell was saying? And I don't know that there are good answers here as of yet. I think it's sociological as well as digital literacy. I don't know that, you know, when we're, you know, I've been thinking a lot about, we live in the post-truth era, so that also complicates things. But I think this is a really, really important topic, and I'm not convinced regulation will get it right. But I think it'll inevitably fall upon developers and deployers to make the best decision that they can. And frankly, unfortunately, I think this ends up sort of being a more of a liability issue, right? That sort of gets debated in the court system, and that's probably what we're all trying to avoid by working with regulators to get it right. But I think it's a really hard one.
So, Dan, do you think the real estate industry is even beginning to think about these things that we've just discussed?
Well, I mean, the Real Estate Data Foundation is doing its best to try and at least get these topics on. And I'm going to answer some of the points here with just more questions, which is arguably not helpful. But so we talked about the consent, which I think is a really interesting topic. And we talked about putting on the click boxes on websites and stuff. In the real estate sector, we're talking about smart buildings all the time, which is fantastic. The benefits are almost endless. But where do you put the click box if you're walking into a building? and someone has to go there. We're not even thinking about the fact that we're collecting data on people all over the place in many, many, many different systems that are not transparent. And just Cordell made some really good examples earlier about cars and airplanes, and I'm absolutely spot on. The difference with real estate is that every building is different. So the tech stack, the people using it, everything about it is different. So it's very difficult to sort of industrialize, which is the background of things like BIM from a building construction point of view. So we have a lot of challenges there, and I think consent is something that's a really interesting topic that we aren't thinking about it enough. I think at the moment you can walk into a building, and I'm not a legal expert, and some people are looking at this for the Red Foundation, but I think you can give consent to terms and conditions that you've never seen, and not only have you never seen them, they don't exist, and that can't possibly be the right situation where that sort of stacks up. And how does it get then when you go into an office, where I'm going to go into an office and my employer has put in all this technology to make my life better, to make the air quality better, to have less of an impact on the planet? What if I then turn around and say, data on me? Does that mean I lose my job? And there are all of these consequences that we just haven't really thought through as a property management and a built environment sector. They're all really tricky questions, and I don't pretend to have good answers to any of them. But I do think that we need to get on the front foot with thinking about them pretty.
Emre, back to you for a quick question from your perspective, having spun out of UCL. What sort of contribution is ongoing from the academic sector to look at this? Because clearly this has become commercialized in huge scale, but arguably there must be some healthy academic debate and discussion that's toying with these problems still.
Yeah. So really kind of what was interesting, so let me say from different parts of the academy. Let's say from the engineering perspective, what was really interesting is that a lot of the stuff we were doing was like what we realized only when we went into industry that was cutting edge. When we actually did this in industry, it was very different. So what we were interested in was trade-off analysis. So we were looking at the kind of subtleties of the kind of the differences in the way in which you would manipulate an algorithm so that its risk would shift from, let's say, you might increase the explainability of the system at the cost of the performance, and so on and so forth. Or you might make an intervention in terms of debiasing the system, and that may have an impact in terms of its performance again, and so on and so forth. When we went and did it in industry was just like map the risk, like just triage this, just tell us, is this area is going to be risky or that area is going to be risky. So there's lots and lots of stuff happening in industry that's quite cutting edge. And when we apply it to industry, we realize what we thought was there's this big gulf. Actually, there's already lots of stuff taking place that can be operationalized or utilized in industry that's super useful from the engineering perspective. So maybe the academics are less aware of actually just how impactful their research could be. From the humanities perspective, this is a much more complex discussion and debate, because I think one of the problems with commentating about the, if you will, industry or algorithms in the world is that it's a bit like becoming a specialist in medicine without spending a day in a hospital. So like these things are in the world, if you will. And what we found is that actually interacting with systems or seeing what's happening in industry is very fruitful from a research perspective. So like in a way, I'll push back a little bit in terms of my peers and my colleagues coming out of some of the different departments to say to them, look, what's really interesting about what's happening with these systems is that when you actually go out and engage with people who are actually in industry, like it's very difficult to depict them in sweeping statements as, everybody is just some kind of, there's this kind of technocracy, like there's this kind of evil force that's occurring. And actually something much more complicated. Like there are good agents, there are bad agents. Most of the time you're not dealing with kind of questions that are to do with, let's say, political or financial interest, but actually to do with problems that are very, very difficult to solve. So like one of the big pushes, I think this is how we came into one another's orbit, Andrew, was there's been a lot of conversation about certification. And that was being driven by industry. And they looked to the academy to say, come up with these standards, let's certify these systems, and we can be done with the problem of trust, if you will. And it just turns out that it's just so much more difficult to do it. So what we found really fruitful in terms of when we're working with industry is just taking a use case, fleshing it out, trying things, and reporting in the way that Dan was mentioning in terms of the transparency. So I see this still as a very formative and indeterminate space. And I see the kind of the role of the academy is really trying to get as involved in a very kind of hands-on perspective as possible.
Thanks. I guess almost the sort of penultimate question, and there's a danger of this being something we could talk for hours on, would be, perhaps I'll start with you, Addie, from your perspective. What do you think regulation would look like? Obviously, it would be, you would be regulated, but what do you think regulation could and should look like for what is such a challenging area, both from a kind of technical and ethical perspective?
Yeah, no, great question. And I would just say that, you know, I'm a huge believer in international standards. I've been an advocate for it for quite some time. I played sort of a leading role in trying to get the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the United States to begin work on their AI risk management framework that will be underpinned by global standards like those at ISO and IEEE. And I think, you know, that's the one way to make sure that regulations can constantly evolve and also stay current at a high level across industries and make sure that we can operate across jurisdictions. I know that that answer can be quite trite to some, but that's just to say that I don't know what the regulatory environment will end up looking like. Obviously, Europe is trying to shape it maybe more than anybody else. But there are other niche examples of you know, I would point to Singapore and the Monetary Authority there as probably going to move even further than the EU in shaping financial services application of AI. And I really applaud the direction that Singapore is going in and to address that, because there are real concerns there and real questions that financial services who are adopting really advanced technologies to support more customers, they have questions about how to manage risk in a regulatory appropriate way. And the standards aren't there yet for financial services. So I think it's sort of this cat and mouse game, I think, or some kind of game where, you know, we're going to be working on standards and regulations simultaneously and hope that they can come together and work across jurisdictions.
Thanks. What are your thoughts on this, Cordell, in terms of what does 21st century regulatory function look like in terms of this ability to be almost ahead of the market, or certainly be future proofed and have the right level? What do you think it could look like?
Well, it should be very different from how we have approached regulation in the past. It can't be command and control. In any event, if you attempt command and control, it won't work. The very technologies are allowing people to bypass conventional regulatory architecture. Yeah, I do believe we're going to see regulation emerging at two levels. The global level, as Addie just said, with a caution that we are going to run into deep difficulties if it becomes a transatlantic discourse. It certainly needs to be far more inclusive, and we must learn from the past. The first industrial revolution, we are benefiting from that revolution today, but too many people were left behind. There was a lot of pain and suffering. And so small island developing states, developing countries, simply because this close acquaintance that we're talking about is no longer dependent on whether you're developed or you're developing. So it has to be an omni-stakeholder, multi-stakeholder engagement. What is clear to me and is irrefutable is we can take no comfort in this age-old notion that regulation must catch up and regulators must catch up. That makes absolutely no sense. Regulators cannot cede innovation to industry. Innovation is not proprietary to industry. The 21st century regulator has to be deeply immersed in exponential technologies and even attempt to be ahead of the curve, with one caveat: you do not overreach, and you place a great premium on co-regulation and a multi-stakeholder approach. And one of the most critical pillars of regulation, apart from the standards and the guidelines on transparency, explainability, mitigation of risk management, governance, etc., a key pillar that we have to pay attention to increasingly is digital literacy. I think that that should be a primary responsibility of regulators. And we should learn, I believe, from the internet experience and the social media experience and not repeat it. We allowed a huge transformation to take place in the world, unprepared for, and that's not a criticism, hindsight is always 2020, but making no effort, quite frankly, to understand, to preempt, if we could, some of the unintended consequences and intended consequences of the internet and social media. I don't believe we should do that with artificial intelligence, but I subscribe to the view that the regulatory intervention must never constrain innovation. But innovation must not be privileged to human centricity, human rights, and human safety.
Thanks, Cordell. Before I perhaps get Dan's view on perhaps an idea of regulation through the real estate lens, I know, Emre, that you're looking at those differences of vertical versus horizontal approaches. What are your thoughts on what regulation can and should look like?
Yeah, it's really interesting for us to be tracking the kind of regulatory debates. And as you mentioned, Andrew, there's kind of two approaches that we found. There's the kind of horizontal approach, which is very much the EU's approach. And then the UK has taken a more vertical approach, so a sector-specific approach. And there's kind of pros and cons to both. One of the things that we found is, with respect to the kind of sectorial approach, is that some of the advantages are just to do with just kind of subject matter expertise, and just like the individual regulators just knowing a lot more and being able to direct in a much more kind of instructive fashion. And so we think that in that respect, even though it's a kind of, it feels like a lesser invasive form of regulatory intervention, ironically, it may be more effective than, let's say, the horizontal approach that's taking place in the EU. The way we read the EU's approach is we think that there's probably going to be, the decade will probably be divided into two. First part is just like people putting in kind of risk governance processes, reporting, kind of best practice emerging, etc. And then we see the second half of the decade as kind of codification of technical standards, or like benchmarking and things like this. So that's how we kind of reading it. That's our kind of anticipation. Really kind of still in that phase of just like people putting on, just adopting kind of governance structures and just beginning the kind of reporting process. But very interesting. I don't know if you're based in the States, Addie, in terms of, we were very surprised by the tabling of the Algorithm Accountability Act by those Democratic congressmen about a month ago or so. And that's a lot quicker, and it was a much bigger kind of intervention than we anticipated. So it does feel like the regulatory debate is kind of heating up.
What are your thoughts, Dan, given obviously, I work for a standard setting and regulatory body, and you're embedded in the sector. How do you see, regulation evolving either on this vertical basis, as Emre's just described, or whether we would be impacted by that more horizontal approach that would catch almost every kind of sector in that sort of, overarching approach?
I think, I mean, the three things that have come up are regulation, standards, and training or skills. And I think all three of those are going to be crucial for the future. I'm not sure they all have to be done by the same body. I think sometimes there's an advantage of them being done by the same body and sometimes advantage of them not. But certainly the future is going to need all of that. And I think that real estate has to be regulated as real estate, but also some of the data and technology aspects have to be regulated as data and technology. And so I think there will have to be a blend in some shape or form, and maybe an emphasis one way or the other, but whether it's a vertical or horizontal, there'll be a bit of both. And I think the challenge is, if you do both badly, you end up missing out a lot of different aspects. I think the other thing I just wanted to say about real estate specifically is we are going from really clever people who've done something in a really traditional way that hasn't changed for a long time into a really different way of doing things. And it's all good for so many reasons, so many benefits and positives, but there have to be realistic expectations which are set in the regulations and the standards about what people can do. And I think that because real estate is so big but fragmented, it has to be done at an industry level. If you look at the pharmaceuticals that came up, or car companies, or the technology companies, whilst they are much better at collaborating with the other players in the market than real estate typically is, they're also much bigger companies at the top who can have a real impact with 3 or 4 companies coming together. Real estate, you get the top 1,000 companies together and you're still only scratching the surface. So it has to be done at an industry level. And then the last thing I wanted to say, which agree really with what Cordell was saying about regulators need to regulate for today, but also have an eye on the future. I think on top of that, they also just need to be much more agile, specifically talking about the real estate sector. We talk about writing standards in 5 years. We'll update them every 10 years. Now, that's worked really well for us in the past because buildings just don't change very often. It doesn't really work for the use of data and technology and AI and all the other things that we're talking about. So not only do we have to do for today and look at tomorrow, but we have to have the processes in place that we can react quickly, because knowing what's going to happen tomorrow and then regulating 10 years behind the curve isn't really that helpful either. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity for all industry bodies, and RICS is leading the way in there. I think there's a really important role about leading the agenda and the discussion. And I guess things like this are a really positive step in the direction, because people need to be thinking about it and talking about it, and they need to hear from people that there are no simple answers. This isn't there's no simple answer that as a real estate professional you're just not privy to. These are really difficult questions that a lot of people are focusing on, but we have to get on the front foot and start thinking about them from a real estate point of view.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'd like to move to closing comments, if I may, after this fascinating conversation, and just go around the virtual table for some final thoughts. But perhaps in those final thoughts, you could almost build on that comment of Dan about, in our small way here, doing some educational pieces, because it does strike me that there's just this huge educational issue. I mean, Cordell talks about, digital literacy at so many levels that stakeholders in the market need to have a better understanding of what's involved here. And I'd be interested to think what you think the role of various actors like ourselves should be around educating the marketplace, because it feels like that, as you said, Cordell, that information asymmetry, I think, exists in so many areas where people simply have to have more awareness. It's not that we all need to run out and learn Python and do all that stuff, but there's got to be some kind of awareness for a lot of people in the overall ecosystem to understand the nature of this particular beast. Addie, what are your closing comments and thoughts?
I was hoping you wouldn't call on me first, so I could write on everybody else's. No, what strikes me, and maybe not directly addressing the question, is that in our process here in Google Cloud, one of the questions we ask ourselves is AI appropriate for the application that is being proposed? And the truth is sometimes AI is simply not. And I think that actually plays to the education piece that we're all sort of dancing around here, which is I think there are some really great opportunities for AI, but I think education must start with educating people on when it's appropriate and when it's not. And I think that also plays into the risk management conversation. And I don't think it has to be a complicated conversation. I think it needs to be one about what are the goals for the application, what's been used before, what is the ability to roll back the application if it proves not to be a better solution. I think we can start with some basic fact finding here and some basic education, because I sometimes feel like this question feels like we're trying to boil the ocean. And so perhaps in my small way, I am just distilling it to those viewpoints.
That's great. Thanks, Addie. Cordell, final thoughts.
Well, the final thoughts are ditto, Addie. with just a little bit to add, which is that I really think that along the lines she has said, to sort of operationalize that approach, that first of all, AI is not a panacea. It won't be good for all things, and we have to talk about that. Do we want autonomous weapons, and then we start having treaties to try to contain them, or do we say just don't go down that road? Because if you have autonomous weapons, one of the intended consequences could be that whereas in the past you might hesitate to start a war because of the human consequences of explaining to a mother or a daughter or a husband or a wife why you have deployed a loved one who has died, now you don't think about those things. And so you could have wars starting easier and earlier and with more frequency. I think we start bodies such as yours and the IIC and all of us by promoting AI governance and start to operationalize soft law instruments. They must not become nice instruments that end up on the shelf. The UNESCO has deliberated on the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. There's the IEE standards on ethical design that should feed into that conversation Addie spoke about in relation to, should we do this? Why are we doing this? What's the consequence? That's what all of those soft law instruments are really addressing. And then I would say we should, I think, challenge technological determinism. Any notion about intelligent systems superseding or replacing human beings is something that we should intuitively resist. And then my last comment is, I have seen that there are some people who seem to be suggesting a human in the loop approach as a panacea. That comes with some dangers. First of all, we could be suffering from delusions of grandeur about our abilities when we come to be relating to smart systems, because we either have algorithmic deference or algorithmic aversion, or in between, clouded by ego. So that's really not a solution, and in essence there is not a solution. But if we close the information, if we get that balance right, close the gap, reduce the information asymmetry, promote digital literacy, and embrace these emerging standards, particularly those that are built on a human-centric approach to artificial intelligence, I think we will land at a good place.
Thanks, Cordell. Emre, your final thoughts.
So just yeah, so thanks. Just again, thanks for organizing this. It's been wonderful to participate and listen to everyone. So I guess from our perspective, the kind of what I would say in terms of the education point is very much just about educating through use cases and examples. So like just looking at just taking a system, a real world system, like just seeing the kind of risks that are associated with it. What does it even mean to be able to communicate about that particular system to various audiences, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there's been a lot of this debate has been taken and just start like just experimenting and doing these kind of projects in the real world. So like just thinking about education by doing or learning by doing, and just like thinking about some real world examples and just thinking about those kind of case studies to kind of bring these kind of discussions to life.
Thanks, Emre. And to you, Dan, final thoughts from through the lens of real estate.
Yeah, through the lens of real estate, I'll keep this really, really short, but there are three different things I wanted to say. The first thing is that the future of the real estate sector will be about real estate and technology coming together. And the cultures of those two sectors could not be more diametrically opposite if they tried. So we have to, as a sector, learn to harness those two cultures for the moving forwards. And I think RICS and other bodies have a major part to play in that. The second one is that one of the often used phrases is data is the new oil. It's an expression I really don't like, and I think it encourages people to look at it as an asset in the same way as it does other things. Data is different, and that education bit has to be about a simple understanding of what data is and isn't. And then the third point I'd make is that this is a really big, complicated area. It's going to get more difficult in time, so we need to start addressing it now. And so the best thing to do is not bury your head in the sand. If I could just give a plug for the Real Estate Data Foundation, it has got 6 data ethical principles. They're very high level, but they're a really good starting point to apply to the things that you're thinking about and decisions you're making in real estate, just to get on the front foot with this. So I think there's a lot to go. There's a lot of positives, but some steps we can take today as well.
Thanks. Well, thanks everyone. It's been a fascinating discussion and I really appreciate all your time this afternoon. So for today, thanks very much, but look forward to talking to you again in the future. Thanks again.